Thanks for joining us on this webinar. And hopefully you've watched the first overview webinar of the Counselor Evaluation Supplement. If you hadn't, we would encourage you to do that. But now we're going to dig into those first 4 standards. And just so you know who's talking to you, I'm Sue Shermer from Heartland Area Education Agency, and I support the work of school counselors here.
And I'm Meredith Doman. I'm the Student Supports Coordinator for Des Moines Public Schools and help support the work of counselors in the district there.
And so what we're going to do in this webinar is really to break down those first 4 standards to give you an idea of how the Iowa teaching standards connect to the school counselor competencies that are identified in the School Counselor Supplement.
And as we explained in the beginning overview, if you have not viewed that webinar yet, this is a supplemental tool for evaluation. It is not something that anyone is required to use, but it is designed to serve as a supportive document to help make the connections between the Iowa teaching standards and the competencies for school counselors, as well as being a reflective tool for counselors and an educational piece to help understand the role of the school counselor for administrators who are doing that evaluation. And so now we're going to dig into the document a little bit deeper and explore standards 1 through 4. So starting with standard 1, student achievement. Again, you have the language of the Iowa teaching standards, and as we look at the aligned school counselor competencies, we're talking about how counselors serve in a broader capacity for student achievement. In addition to the classroom, they're also providing some leadership, advocacy, collaboration skills, and working towards systemic change in our schools, all to support student achievement and overall student development. So as you look here, you'll see those themes that are so important running throughout the ASCA model, looking at leadership, advocacy, collaboration, and systemic change. As we dig in, again, we've mentioned before, the opportunity to be effective should be available for all counselors. So as we look at leadership, it's about being viewed by peers and the community as a building leader and participating in those building-based plans to promote student achievement. Now that also means we need to be, in the developing level, knowledgeable about those plans and goals, but also then to take that to another level of highly effective would include active involvement in building and district teams, being visible out in the community, and taking leadership roles in those activities. So that would be the highly effective. Moving on to advocacy, we're looking at how we work to remove barriers for student success. Also working with how we advocate on behalf of students in all that we do. And then also taking it to another level is looking at the systems that exist and trying to do our part to remove those barriers. And actually, as we know, sometimes that is impacted by policy at a state, building, or district level. And so looking at those policies and being aware of them and working to advocate those changes as well. When we look at collaboration, again, how we are collaborating with our colleagues. The work of student achievement is too big for counselors to do alone, and it's too big to be done without counselors as well. So we have to collaborate together to get that done. Taking it to another level of initiating those collaborations and just being a highly collaborative counselor. Looking at systemic change is the process here of identifying problems that exist, but also trying to find solutions then towards them. Not just identifying the problems as noticing them, but working towards solutions and then creating plans and moving towards those action stages. Now, as we were talking, I did not highlight the ineffective column, but do want to acknowledge that it's there. When we don't see a connection between the work we're doing as counselors and student achievement goals of our building or district, we're missing a huge opportunity to serve our students. And therefore, that is under the ineffective column. We also can't have our heads in the sand about barriers that exist out there, and so we need to look for them, acknowledge them, and advocate to remove them. And again, with the relationships that are so important, as we know as counselors, they're central to all that we do. And really, those relationships come before that advocacy work a lot of the time. So making sure that we have those professional relationships and that we are a part of that professional school culture, acknowledging that sometimes there are things that aren't specifically relevant to our content area, but it's important that we know enough to be able to reinforce the work classroom teachers are doing and others in our building are doing as well. And then looking at systemic change again, that sometimes not being aware of those things can contribute to systemic problems that exist in our schools.
So let's move on to standard 2, which is content knowledge. If you think about this in the broader sense of those 3 domains of academic, career, and personal social development, Those are in the foundation of everything we do. And when I say personal social development, we're also referring back to social emotional learning. A lot of the research uses the phrase social emotional learning, which is very much in line with ASCA's definition of personal social development. So both of those connect together. So if we look at the aligned school counselor competencies for that idea of content knowledge, those are understanding the ASCA national model and the Iowa framework, understand those 3 domains, use student standards in order to move your work forward. Not just, oh, I like this lesson, so I'm going to do it, but you have a real clear picture of what you're going to do. And then, of course, we move into individual student planning and responsive services. So as we look at the rubric, the first one is that national state framework, and understand that in a perfect world, we would all run and ask a national model. However, we also understand that sometimes there are barriers in place to make that happen. At the bare minimum, you should have the Iowa Framework for School Counseling, and that is listed right here under effective, but it's also what's required from our state legislature. Our administrative rule says that we will offer a framework. We will follow the Iowa Framework, which is that it lists out those areas of domains. It lists out the core curriculum, individual planning, and responsive service. So then if we look down to the domains and standards, you'll see that, yes, we've got all 3. Now, we understand that at the elementary level, you might have a little bit more in that personal social and a little less in career planning. But the bottom line is that all 3 domains are identified, that are supported at each grade band. And then if we move on to individual student planning, we know that a lot of times we think about that in terms of career planning or academic planning. And so it's really easy to say, oh, well, that's just done at the high school. But some of that is also done at the elementary level. Very little, but there is some. At the same time, again, we have those career pathways that are identified in administrative rule, and we want to make sure that all students meet those state requirements related to career and academic planning. Not just meeting them for the sake of meeting that need or checking a box off, but rather helping students to understand how to plan for their future. And finally, the responsive services. Are you just running a small group because you think it's a great idea, or do you have some data to point to that need in your school? Do you have support in place for students and families in need? Are you collaborating with internal and external resources to make that happen? What's your referral process? And does everyone know what that referral process is? And then finally, are you removing barriers that would prevent students or families from accessing those services?
And so now as we look at Standard 3, planning, this is about planning and preparing for instruction. And we need to acknowledge in here as school counselors that we deliver instruction in a variety of settings and environments, utilizing a variety of methods, because we do have our classroom component, but also individual and small groups, and also recognizing that counseling programs are delivered in a variety of ways across the state. And so we may have some face-to-face or electronic collaborations with our delivery of our instruction as well. And so our core curriculum is also, again, designed to be best delivered in collaboration with classroom teachers. The content that we teach is best interpreted by students and best used for their growth when they're hearing and reinforcing the same message in all aspects of their lives. So looking at what we use to develop that program and having the core competencies, this is about making sure that all student needs are covered through the full program implementation. As you see here, the core curriculum is incredibly important, and also that it is comprehensive, it's developmental, and that the curriculum is also planned to be delivered to every student. So as we're looking at planning, it's about every student, it's about the core competencies for students, and also then creating action plans that are aligned with goals of the school and the school counseling program. When we get into the rubric here, you'll see the two areas separated out with core curriculum and action plans. Looking that the student standards have been used and crosswalked with the appropriate guidance curriculum. So whatever curriculum is being used should be tied to Ask a Student standards. And again, based on the needs of students developmentally and preventatively. Also having that staff encouragement to connect the curriculum delivered by the counselor with day-to-day life in the classroom, and also having the materials and instructional strategies that meet student needs and goals. So this is truly about how we're planning and preparing for the instruction that we deliver to all students to make sure everything is covered. Now, taking that to a highly effective level, in addition to the Ask a Student standards, we might be looking at our Iowa Core standards or other student standards that might be used locally in order to align our guidance curriculum with those. Also involves having the student needs and school goals are met using a variety of instructional strategies, and also might be using a Closing the Gap activity as well. In addition to the curriculum that's done for all, there might be Closing the Gap for students who need additional support. All of this is then designed to be aligned with our action plans. So in addition to the curriculum, there's small groups and Closing the Gap action plans, all aligned to the same competencies for students. We might have just some of these areas covered: school curriculum, small groups, and Closing the Gap. Now, when we get into how that looks like developing or needing improvement, or also even ineffective, is that we have things that are random. We have things that are not necessarily aligned to student outcomes. So as we're looking at maybe a few lessons we have are tied to some standards, but maybe how those flow through our K-12 system are not intentional or not connected. The strategies used are not necessarily aligned to meeting our student needs or with the school goals. And then the random lessons that we pull off of a shelf and implement and deliver that aren't even aligned to standards would actually be ineffective. We're just taking up students' time without a purpose when we're doing that. And so it does not create an action plan to have anything. Again, leads to the randomness and not aligned program implementation. Looking at creating and implementing sporadic and inconsistent action plans again. So to be effective, there needs to be tied to, at a minimum, the ASCA standards, which are the broadest standards available, could be aligned more specifically to be more highly effective to local and state standards. And then those action plans are aligned across all of the counseling areas.
And finally, let's look at Standard 4, which is considered the diverse learner standard. When you think about that, for a teacher, that means the multiple learning needs of students. Of course, for counselors, that's much more broad. It's not only that you are reaching the multiple learning needs of students, but that you are really advocating for those differentiated needs of equity and access for each student. So as we look down at those aligned school counselor competencies, you'll see all of those that are connected to those equitable access needs so that every student has access to the guidance program. Also, if you look down to the second one, you've got understanding of collaborations with stakeholders. How can you connect all of that educational equity and success for every student, along with parents, guardians, teachers, community members? And then, of course, we move into those areas of multicultural, ethical, and professional competencies, working with various student populations, and understanding some of those different needs when it comes to students with special needs and multicultural needs. So looking at the rubric, those really divide out into three distinct areas. The first one is equitable programming. When you think about who doesn't have access to that comprehensive program, if you look down in the ineffective, you see that one size fits all. That never works, and we know that in education. But if we move up into developing, we understand that there's a need for that, but we really haven't quite got there. In the effective and highly effective, you're planning those programs using data, and you're disaggregating the data by various student diversity groups so that you see who's missing what, and how might we seek some solutions to those barriers that stand in the way of student success. Of course, to take that one step further into the highly effective, then you are really collaborating and consulting with different stakeholder groups. You're continuously adapting and maintaining that program that supports all students' needs. Moving on down to the culturally responsive collaboration, this just seems like a no-brainer in many ways, but at the same time, we need to build trust. We need to use those community partnerships. We need to access those. Not only, oftentimes we think of diversity as just those differences in culture. Remember, every student has a different culture. And so we really need to think about individual students and individual student groups and how we might move those forward, and helping students understand that we want to help them move forward, helping communities understand that we have different needs and that school might not look the same as it did years ago. And finally, that advocacy and promoting awareness. Not only are you participating in those new initiatives, but you are really applying what you know about diversity and individual learning needs to your program and how you might advocate at the district, state, or national level. Oftentimes we see different populations being left out or different groups being left out, and that's what we're about. We're breaking down those barriers, and we're really making sure that every student in the building has access to a comprehensive guidance program. Again, if you have any questions, any feedback, or any suggestions, please contact Sue Shermer at Heartland Area Education Agency or Meredith Doman at Des Moines Schools.